When a cocky cop tried to flex his authority on Chuck Norris, he thought his badge made him untouchable. But power blinds fools. Seconds later, he was disarmed, humiliated, and taught a brutal lesson in respect by the last man you ever want to challenge. But before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It was a perfect spring afternoon in Los Angeles' Griffith Park. The kind of day where everything seems right with the world. Families were spreading their picnic blankets on the fresh grass. Children were chasing butterflies, and the air was filled with the sweet sound of birds chirping in the century-old oak trees. On a weathered wooden bench beneath the largest oak in the park sat a man who needed no introduction, Chuck Norris. Wearing his signature denim shirt and cowboy hat, he was quietly feeding pigeons from a small paper bag. His presence commanded respect without demanding it. His calm demeanor, a stark contrast to the bustling park around him. But peace never lasts long when pride and power collide. Officer Brad Thompson was patrolling the park that day, his polished boots crushing the gravel beneath them with each determined step. He was known among the locals as the Park Tyrant, a man who turned a simple park patrol job into his personal kingdom. As Thompson spotted Chuck on the bench, a smirk crossed his face. He had no idea that his next decision would change his life forever. What Officer Thompson didn't know was that his reputation had already preceded him. Just that morning, 3 separate families had filed complaints about his aggressive behavior. One elderly woman claimed he'd threatened to arrest her for feeding ducks. A young father said Thompson had forced his children off the playground for being too loud. But the badge on his chest and the growing chip on his shoulder made him feel untouchable. Thompson had joined the park police force 5 years ago after failing to make it as a regular police officer. His instructors at the academy had noted his concerning tendency toward excessive authority, a polite way of saying he enjoyed pushing people around. But here in the park, he'd found his perfect playground for petty power trips. As he approached Chuck's bench, Thompson's hand rested casually on his baton. The afternoon sun caught his badge, sending sharp reflections across the park. A group of teenagers nearby lowered their phones, sensing something was about to happen. A young mother hurriedly gathered her children, recognizing Thompson's walk. The same strut he'd used when he'd ruined their birthday picnic last month. Chuck continued feeding the pigeons, seemingly oblivious to the approaching storm. But those who looked closely might have noticed something in his eyes. A quiet awareness, like a martial arts master sensing an opponent's first move before it's made. Thompson stopped directly in front of Chuck, intentionally casting his shadow over him. The pigeons scattered, but Chuck remained still, his weathered hands holding the last few breadcrumbs. What happened next would become a story told in this park for generations. Officer Thompson cleared his throat dramatically, but Chuck didn't look up. "Sir," Thompson barked, drawing out the word with mocked politeness. "This bench is for active park use only, no loitering." Chuck slowly raised his eyes to meet Thompson's. "I'm not loitering, officer. I'm actively feeding these birds, and they seem pretty active to me." He gestured to the pigeons hopping around enthusiastically. Thompson's face reddened. "Don't get smart with me, old man. You think this is funny?" "No, sir," Chuck replied, calmly. "But these birds might. They're the only ones here getting fed up." A few onlookers chuckled, which only infuriated Thompson more. "Listen here." Thompson leaned in, trying to be intimidating. "I don't care who you think you are. When I give an order, people follow it. Chuck adjusted his cowboy hat slightly. You know, officer, I've found that people who have to tell others how important they are usually aren't. The crowd around them had grown. Phones were out, recording. Someone whispered, "Is that really him?" Another voice answered, "That cop has no idea who he's messing with." "Final warning," Thompson growled, his hand tightening on his baton. "Move! Now!" Chuck calmly reached into his paper bag and pulled out another handful of breadcrumbs. "Officer, I respect the law, but right now, the only thing breaking the peace in this park is your attitude." Thompson's face went from red to purple. He'd never been so openly challenged, and certainly never with such calm confidence. This quiet defiance was worse than any shouting match he'd ever had. His grip on his baton tightened as his patience finally snapped. Thompson yanked his baton free with a metallic snap. "Stand up now. You might want to reconsider that," Chuck said softly, still seated. "Not for my sake, for yours." Thompson swung his baton towards Chuck's shoulder, a move he'd used countless times to establish dominance. But this time was different. Without seeming to move at all, Chuck's hand intercepted the baton mid-swing. He held it firmly, and Thompson found himself unable to pull it free. "What the—" "Let go," Thompson sputtered, his face burning with embarrassment. "Son," Chuck said calmly, still holding the baton, "there are 3 things you need to know right now. First, that badge gives you responsibility, not power. Second, I've spent more time in martial arts, training than you've spent on this earth. And third," he released the baton with a slight smile, "you really should have Googled me before starting this." A teenager in the crowd shouted out, "That's Chuck Norris, man! He's a legend!" Thompson's embarrassment turned to rage. He holstered his baton and reached for his taser. "On your feet! You're under arrest for assaulting an officer." Chuck finally stood up, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Officer, we both know that's not true. Just like we both know there's no law against feeding pigeons in this park." "Shut up!" Thompson's hand shook as he aimed the taser. "I said you're under arrest." An older woman in the crowd called out, "Someone call the real police. This has gone too far." Chuck remained perfectly still, his eyes locked on Thompson's. "Young man, I've faced down armed terrorists who were calmer than you are right now. Why don't we both take a breath and talk about what's really bothering you?" Thompson's finger tightened on the taser trigger, but something in Chuck's steady gaze made him hesitate. In that moment of uncertainty, he did something that would prove to be his biggest mistake yet. He reached for his service weapon. The crowd gasped as Thompson drew his service weapon. Even the birds scattered, leaving an eerie silence in the park. "Last chance," Thompson's voice cracked slightly. "On the ground, old man." Chuck didn't move. His expression remained calm, but his eyes had taken on a different quality, like a teacher watching a student make a crucial mistake. "You know what's interesting about guns, officer?" Chuck's voice was conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "They make people feel powerful, but real power." He took one step forward. "Real power is knowing when not to use it. Stay back." Thompson's hand was visibly shaking now. "I said stay back, or what?" "Or what?" Chuck asked softly. "You'll shoot an unarmed man in front of all these witnesses for feeding pigeons?" A bead of sweat rolled down Thompson's forehead. In all his years of bullying park-goers, he'd never faced someone who seemed so completely unafraid of him. I'm not playing around," Thompson stammered. "Neither am I," Chuck replied. Chuck's movement was almost too fast to see. Suddenly, Thompson's gun was in pieces on the ground, and Chuck was standing exactly where he had been before, as if he hadn't moved at all. What did you... Thompson stared at his empty hand in disbelief. 30 years of martial arts, Chuck said simply. But more importantly, 40 years of learning when not to use them. The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the children who had been playing nearby stood still, sensing they were watching something extraordinary. "You have two choices now, son," Chuck continued. "You can keep escalating this situation, or you can take a moment to think about why you felt the need to draw a weapon on a man feeding birds." Before Thompson could respond, a commanding voice cut through the tension. "Thompson! Stand down, immediately!" Two senior officers were rushing toward them, hands on their holsters. The older one, Captain Martinez, took one look at Chuck, and his eyes widened in recognition. "Mr. Norris, sir," Martinez said respectfully, then turned to Thompson. "Officer Thompson, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" Thompson pointed frantically at Chuck. "He assaulted me. He grabbed my weapon after you pulled it on me for feeding pigeons." Chuck added mildly, "Don't forget that part." Martinez looked at the disassembled gun on the ground, then back at Thompson. "You drew your weapon over bird feeding? He wouldn't comply." Thompson's voice had risen to a near squeak. "He was loitering and loitering. That's not even a valid citation in this park." Martinez cut him off. "We've talked about this, Thompson, multiple times." The second officer, Johnson, was already collecting statements from the crowd. "Sir," he called to Martinez, "I've got at least 12 witnesses saying Officer Thompson escalated the situation without cause, plus about 20 videos. And it's Chuck Norris. For heaven's sake!" Martinez rubbed his temples. "The man's trained half the law enforcement in Texas." Thompson's face had gone from red to pale. I didn't know." "Badge and gun?" Martinez held out his hand. "Right now." As Thompson slowly unpinned his badge, Chuck spoke up. "Captain, if I might have a word?" Martinez turned to Chuck with respect. "Of course, sir. I think your officer here isn't a bad person," Chuck said thoughtfully. "Just someone who's lost his way." The crowd had grown larger, with people filming and whispering among themselves. Some were already posting the videos online, their excited chatter filling the air. "Lost his way?" Thompson scoffed weakly. "You don't know anything about me." "I know more than you think," Chuck replied. "I see a man who probably dreams of making a difference when he first put on that uniform. But somewhere along the way, you started confusing respect with fear." Several people in the crowd nodded. An elderly lady stepped forward. "He threatened to arrest my grandson last week for skateboarding." "And my kids," another parent added, for laughing too loud. Thompson's shoulders slumped as more stories emerged. Each complaint seemed to deflate him further, the reality of his behavior finally sinking in. "The thing about fear, son," Chuck continued, his voice carrying across the now quiet park, "is that it's like a boomerang. Use it against others, and it'll eventually come back to you. I saw it in your eyes when you pulled that gun. You were scared. I wasn't scared, Thompson muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Everyone gets scared, Chuck said. The brave ones admit it. The wise ones learn from it. Captain Martinez watched this exchange with growing interest. He'd expected to find a disaster. Instead, he was witnessing something entirely different. A moment of transformation. Chuck turned to Captain Martinez. You know, in my years of teaching martial arts, I've seen this before. Sometimes the most aggressive students turn out to be the best ones, once they learn to channel that energy properly. Thompson looked up surprised. What are you talking about? I'm talking about second chances? Chuck said, Captain, instead of firing him, what if Officer Thompson here went through some additional training? Maybe some martial arts classes to learn discipline. Some community service to reconnect with the people he's supposed to protect. Martinez considered this. Mr. Norris, after what he just pulled? I know, Chuck interrupted gently, but think about it. Which serves the community better? Firing him and letting that anger fester, or helping him become the officer he should have been from the start? Tom stared at Chuck, bewildered. Why would you help me? I tried to, Chuck revealed, because 30 years ago, I was a lot like you. Angry, always trying to prove myself. Then I had a teacher who showed me a better way. Sometimes that's all a person needs. The crowd had gone quiet, absorbing this unexpected turn of events. The same elderly lady who had complained earlier spoke up. If Mr. Norris thinks he deserves a chance, well, I suppose we could too. Captain Martinez nodded slowly. It would mean a demotion, mandatory counseling, and a complete retraining program. And, Chuck added with a slight smile, I know a good dojo in the area. The instructor there owes me a favor. Thompson's eyes were glistening now. I don't deserve this. No, Chuck agreed. But that's what grace is all about. The real question is, are you willing to do the work? Thompson's training wouldn't be easy. Captain Martinez laid out the terms. 6 months probation, starting at the lowest rank. Weekly counseling sessions. Community service every weekend, and most importantly, mandatory martial arts training with Chuck's recommended instructor, a notoriously strict Marine veteran. And, Martinez added sternly, one more complaint about power abuse, one single incident, and you're not just fired mandatory martial arts training with Chuck's recommended instructor, a notoriously strict Marine veteran. And, Martinez added sternly, one more complaint about power abuse, one single incident, and you're not just fired, you'll be facing charges. Those videos won't disappear. The crowd seemed satisfied with this justice. Several people were already sharing their videos with captions like, Chuck Norris teaches corrupt cop a lesson, and instant karma for park bully. Chuck gathered the pieces of Thompson's disassembled gun from the ground, reassembling it with expert precision. Instead of handing it back to Thompson, he gave it to Martinez. He'll earn this back when he's ready. If he's ready, Martinez corrected him. Chuck returned to his bench, in his bag of birdseed. The pigeons, sensing the tension had passed, began to return. Thompson stood there awkwardly, his uniform feeling heavier than ever without his badge and gun. Officer Thompson, Chuck called out, not looking up from the pigeons. One more thing. Yes, sir. Every morning for the next 6 months, before your shift starts, you'll be cleaning this park, all of it. Every piece of trash, every leaf. And while you're at it, you might want to think about how many people you've bullied in the same park. Each one of them deserves a personal apology. Word spread quickly about what happened that day in Griffith Park. Videos went viral, showing not just Chuck's incredible disarm, but also his unexpected blend of justice and wisdom. The story became something of a local legend. Thompson did show up the next morning at dawn, trash bag in hand, and every morning after that. Some days, early joggers would see him practicing martial arts moves between picking up litter, clumsy at first but gradually improving. The angry strut was gone from his walk, replaced by something more measured, more mindful. Chuck would stop by occasionally, wordlessly feeding his pigeons while Thompson worked. No conversation needed. The lesson had been learned. Sometimes the heaviest hits come not from fists or weapons, but from simple acts of both justice and mercy. The park changed too. Families returned, kids played freely again, and even the pigeons seemed more at peace. The park tyrant was gone, and in his place, a humbled man was slowly rebuilding his reputation. One piece of trash, one apology, and one martial arts lesson at a time. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. And remember, true strength isn't about how much power you have, but how you choose to use it. Share in the comments your thoughts about this encounter. This is Ludwig, and I'll see you in the next video.